HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Picnic, A Dream of Freedom and the Collapse of the Iron Curtain by Matthew Longo. Read by Tom Parks. Prologue. Freedom's Promise. Laszlo gives me a tour of what is nowhere. How did the East Germans even find this place? He wonders aloud. It is annus mundi, he says, the asshole of the world. No one knew about this part of the borderlands. On maps, only the line was represented, but not the vast stretch of no-go zones that comprised the Iron Curtain, the militarized frontier that emerged after World War II, dividing Europe between East, Soviet influence, and West, American influence. If the full boundary system wasn't shown, the logic went, people couldn't find it. Thus, the reality of the border was itself divided. For the military, the border regime was precise. For the average person, it was mysterious and threatening. Laszlo takes me to the edge of the woods. We follow the tree line down a slope through tall grass. When we round a bend, a clearing opens up. This is where the picnickers parked, he says. The field on which Laszlo and I are standing was the site of the Pan-European picnic, held on August 19, 1989, on the Austrian-Hungarian border, a giant, open-air party celebrating European togetherness and freedom, which furnished the stage for the greatest breach of the border in Cold War history. Hundreds of East German refugees dashing toward freedom, the initial tug by which the entire Iron Curtain would unspool. Or as Helmut Kohl, chancellor of a newly reunified Germany, would later put it, where the first stone was removed from the Berlin Wall. The picnic has largely been omitted from history books, pushed aside by the macroscopic politics of the end of the Cold War. Gorbachev and Reagan, the machinations of Moscow and Washington. This focus is understandable, but sometimes the most important moments in history are forged by ordinary people, under circumstances unexpected and strange, sometimes in forgotten places, too. The field in Chopin-Puszta today is utterly desolate, a sea of grass that obscures human pathways. It is a place filled with history, but also emptied of it, a reminder that history cannot speak for itself. It must be given voice. Even annus mundi, if you listen to it, has a lot to say. When I first heard the story of the picnic, I just spent years researching the U.S.-Mexico border and its security expansion after 9/11. After so much time studying how borders get built up, I was eager to learn how they might be torn down, and the Iron Curtain, no less, among the most terrifying instruments of oppression ever devised. I am a child of the 1980s. I remember seeing the fall of the Berlin Wall on TV, watching the celebrations, all those people dancing atop the carcass of Leviathan. It is an indelible image of freedom, even today. One government toppled after another. Czechoslovakia in November, Romania in December, ending with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Then, for many in the West, the 1990s were boom years. It was the age of globalization and life-changing technologies. The Cold War was over, and we believed the world would become a more interconnected place, that the reactionary forces of the past would give way to the progressive minds of the future. With the victory of liberalism, we had found the best, most just system of political organization. The year 1989 was a triumphant one. But from the vantage of today, there is something hard to reconcile about it, too. Across the East, people are watching their liberties slip, especially in Hungary, under the increasingly authoritarian grip of Viktor Orban, and the West, riven by inequality, seems to be splitting at the seams. Even that first day, listening to Laszlo and Chopin-Puszta, I had the feeling that the story of the picnic wasn't just about the rush to freedom, the end of one era and the beginning of another, but something bigger, prefiguring the world we live in now. It marked a moment of ideological fracture we are still experiencing. In our political discourse, we frequently throw around the word freedom as though its meaning is self-evident. It is a vision of doing what we want and going where we please, of voting booths and demonstrations, of large supermarkets with a dizzying array of colorful products and plentiful food. But freedom is a complicated ideal. Over the course of this writing, in the United States, #Black Lives Matter activism has been widespread in response to racist police brutality. At the same time, state responses to the COVID-19 pandemic have pitted anti-establishment groups against the federal government. These clashes emerge from different sides of the ideological divide, but they are also, each in their own way, about freedom. Freedom to live in safety from state violence on the one hand, freedom from state paternalism on the other. That is, people on both sides of the political spectrum are saying the same thing. They are also using the same word to say different things. How did we get from the revolutionary fervor of 1989 to this? From tearing down the Berlin Wall to our new age of erecting barriers? It is fall 2018, one of my first trips to the Hungarian borderlands. The mix of wonderment and confusion is present, I suspect, on my face. Laszlo Nagy looks at me skeptically. He is the secretary of the Pan-European Picnic 89 Foundation and its unofficial ambassador. You have no idea how messy it's been, he says. The infighting, the scandals, you'll see at the 30th. He is referring to the 30th anniversary of the picnic, a giant gala planned for the coming summer. The picnic was decades ago, I say. Why would there be scandals now? Laszlo regards me, his expression dark and cynical. There's a saying popular in Hungary, he says. The future is certain. It's the past that keeps changing. Part 1. Just Kids. Chapter 1. It was June 20th, 1989. A warm summer night, by all accounts, a perfect occasion for dreaming. The dinner table at the Grand Hotel Armbika, the Golden Bowl, housed in a stately Art Nouveau building in Debrecen, Hungary, brought together an odd assembly of guests. Ferenc Mészáros, broad-shouldered, scraggly-haired, eyes seemingly focused on something beyond the present, and a group of other young would-be activists from the East, alongside a family of aristocrats from the West. For Ferenc and many of the other Hungarians present, this was the most elegant dinner they had ever been invited to. Ferenc had been in and out of gangs in his teenage years. He and his friends had engaged in petty mischief and hosted boxing matches outside the city with the other gangs, defending their turf and roughing up anyone who got caught in the middle. The high walls and chandeliers of the hotel, the building was commissioned by Alfred Hajós, Hungary's first Olympic gold medalist. Bela Bartok played concerts there. Its starched linens and wine that flowed unbidden into their glasses, all this was new and exciting. So, too, was political activism. The Hungarians came from a wide range of backgrounds. What united them was their membership in the MDF, Magyar Demokrata Forum, or Hungarian Democratic Forum, a newly formed opposition group. Political parties were illegal in communist Hungary, but as of the previous fall, some organizing was tolerated. The MDF advocated democratic elections and returning power to the people. This platform spoke to Ferenc. According to the communist ideal, everyday workers were supposed to be empowered. But Ferenc knew this was just propaganda. His people had never enjoyed any kind of leadership, and many intellectuals expressed outright prejudice against them. When the MDF had started its chapter in Debrecen, Ferenc joined. The occasion of the meal at the Arambika was the arrival of Austrian diplomat Otto von Habsburg, then Vice President of the European Parliament and would-be heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire had it not folded half a century earlier. He was in town to deliver a lecture entitled Hungary's Chances of Catching Up at the Kossuth Lajos University, founded before the First World War by his father. Habsburg was a frequent visitor to Hungary, given the historical connections between the two states that once formed the empire over which his family had presided, long before the Soviet Union took over after World War II, before the communist era began. Hungary, now on the other side of the Iron Curtain, had fallen into economic disrepair, and Habsburg was eager to discuss how it might forge a path forward. His speech at the university was packed. More than 2,000 students attended. The dinner after the talk was small and select, mostly friends of Lukács Szabó, a member of the MDF, who had family connections to Habsburg and had invited him to come speak. Among the activists, reaction to the event was mixed. Some were eager to meet the famous scion, others were dubious. How could a man like that understand our situation, Ferenc had wondered. He decided to go anyway. He carried his doubts about Habsburg through the talk and into the dinner. Conversation over the table began timidly. Political matters weren't openly discussed at that time in Hungary, certainly not in public. But something about the night, the fact that Habsburg was there, lent the air around them a kind of magic. Habsburg spoke in fluent Hungarian, a gesture to their shared past, and talked in terms of we and our, enough to temper even the hardest cynic. Shortly, one by one, the young Hungarians jumped into the conversation, building upon Habsburg's vision for a borderless Europe, a space of freedom and community that would bridge the Iron Curtain and reunite East and West. The night grew long and cheerful, drunk as everyone was from the setting. This still too uncommon meeting of minds across the political divide. Eventually, the young activists began calling the elderly aristocrat Uncle Otto. When the conversation turned to Hungary, they waxed poetic about the reforms underway, how far they had come, how far they still had to go. It was a good time for such imaginings. Since the rise of Mikhail Gorbachev in 1985 and the rhetoric of glasnost, political openness, and perestroika, economic restructuring, there was a feeling that the very foundation of the Soviet Union was trembling and something new was emerging. But it was a time steeped in uncertainty, too. If the Soviet Union did fall, would it go quietly or in a paroxysm of violence? For all the talk of change, by the summer of 1989, Europe was still physically cut in half. On one side was the West, land of free movement and democracy. On the other, the Soviet Union's unique brand of communist authoritarianism, and between them, an iron curtain of munitions, cameras, and barbed wire that extended from the Baltic to the Black Sea. From the village of Debrecen, a leafy, wide-avenued city close to the Romanian border, the Cold War remained hauntingly present. Surrounding the city were 3 Soviet barracks, a training area, and the second biggest military airport in the country. As a border city, Debrecen operated as a transit hub for the more than 100,000 Soviet troops stationed on Hungarian soil. No one expected them to do anything, but the last time they had, in 1956, there had been a massacre. This was only a generation ago. Many of the activists present had parents who'd taken part in the uprising, had grown up listening to stories of the brutal Soviet crackdown that followed. As the evening at the Arambika drew to its close, an uncomfortable silence set in. Everyone knew how challenging it was to effect political change. They were all too aware of the barriers that still circumscribed their lives. The wall that divided Berlin, The Iron Curtain, which, despite recent reforms, felt as uncompromising as ever. At this point, Ferenc spoke up. He shared the grand vision of a united Europe, where peoples were not separated by barbed wire and a spirit of togetherness could reign. But he felt that a fancy hotel was no place to talk about it. We should be out with the people, he said, out by the Iron Curtain itself. We should throw a party, he said, a picnic. Ferenc had big dreams. He envisioned a gathering at the border, with Austrians on one side and Hungarians on the other. Maybe they could have a bonfire, roasting pigs on either side, or maybe they could pass pieces of sausage or cold beers back and forth across the barbed wire. After his proposal, the conversation took off, the others parrying ideas in wine-soaked fervor, each coming up with something more ridiculous than the last. Everyone had a good laugh and went home. Surely, the state would never actually allow such a thing. And what could they even do to set it up? After all, they lived about 400 kilometers east of the Austrian border, a long distance in any era, let alone one without basic telecommunications. Ferenc hadn't understood yet that the Iron Curtain was not really a line, but a several kilometers wide expanse of electric fencing and military installations. He had never been to the Austrian border. Before his dinner with Habsburg, he had never even met an Austrian. Still, the thought lingered. What better way to thumb their nose at this most despised institution, the Iron Curtain, emblematic of the freedoms forbidden them? But how could they do it? It seemed impossible. In authoritarian societies, people grow used to living off their dreams. In many parts of the Eastern Bloc, political repression was so ruthless that activism of any sort was almost unimaginable. In Hungary, conditions were a bit better. It was the most open of the eastern states, but overt political organizing was still a terra incognita. Certainly, there was no protocol that would-be activists like Ferenc could point to. They had to be guarded. Their meetings were infiltrated by the secret police and its informants, including friends and family members. And yet, the more Ferenc thought about the picnic, the larger it grew in his mind. On June 30th, a little over a week after the dinner with Habsburg, Ferenc raised the idea at a meeting of the Debrecen chapter of the MDF, held at their usual spot, a cozy, unassuming beer house called Kiss Debrecen, Little Debrecen, with a scratched-up, wood-paneled interior and a patio out back. Ferenc spoke excitedly about the idea, the dramatic spectacle it would be. The picnic would represent community and freedom, he said. The dream of life without political constraints, of not being told where one could or couldn't go, what one could or couldn't do. When Ferenc finished his oration, he looked expectantly around the room, but his words were met coolly. There were much more important things to be working on than a picnic, the MDF leadership told him. They were trying to become a real political party, after all. Ferenc might have given up on the idea then and there, if not for a young woman who stood up from her seat in the back of the crowded chamber. "I'll help organize it," she said. Maria Philipp came from a long line of anti-communist dissidents. Her father had fought in the uprising against Soviet rule in 1956 as a messenger delivering secret news among the insurgents. Though only a child then, Maria remembers it vividly, even watching the Soviet tanks as they rolled in. Her family remained political even after the revolution was suppressed. They listened together to the illegal radio broadcasts, usually on low volume with the windows closed, even in the summer. The broadcasts were on in the background when Maria went to sleep. Radio Free Europe was my bedtime story, she likes to say. By 1989, Maria had already been politically active for some time. That previous fall, she'd begun organizing support for the persecuted Hungarian minority in Transylvania, a mountainous region in neighboring Romania, living under the brutal dictator Nicolae Ceausescu. She had been looking for a new cause to rally behind. A picnic at the Iron Curtain? The idea was so outlandish, she was instantly hooked. Maria and Ferenc became the nucleus of a team. Whereas Ferenc was a dreamer, Maria was a doer. She worked at a construction company with access to a telephone, a rarity in communist Hungary, which had the fewest telephones per capita in the whole Eastern Bloc. The Hungarian state decided the people didn't need them, a restrictive but short-sighted move. By contrast, Ceausescu's Romania encouraged phone use. That way the state could listen in. A whirl with energy, Maria soon took charge. She thought Ferenc's plan should be broader, and suggested inviting the participants of a group she was involved in, the Sorkurseg, or Common Fate Camp, which gathered reform-minded peoples from across the East, from Estonia to Yugoslavia. The Iron Curtain was despised by everyone, she thought, so they should all protest it together. Soon they had a name, the Pan-European Picnic, and a draft program. They even had a logo, a dove bursting through barbed wire. The target date was mid-August, less than 2 months away. Ferenc and Maria knew the challenges of staging such an event would be immense. The borderland was a dangerous, prohibited place, and they had neither people nor funds. But they decided to go ahead anyway. Once they started planning, others would join in, they reasoned. But now came the hard part. What would it mean to actually organize a picnic across the Iron Curtain? We tend to think of the Iron Curtain in binary terms. It was the world's harshest border, until it wasn't. But thinking in this way obscures the shifting tectonics taking place beneath the surface, rife with friction. In Hungary, reform had been brewing for some time behind the scenes, with upstarts within the ruling Communist Party, officially the Magyar Szocialista Munkaspárt, MSCMP, or the Hungarian Socialist Workers' Party, embracing some of the same ideas, freedom and democracy, ending the Soviet occupation, as those toiling on the outside. Communication was thin between these groups, and the path marked with obstacles. But the ground for activism was fertile. Even so, at the picnic, the line between redemption and bloodshed was razor thin. To understand how it came together, we have to rewind to November 1988 and the rise of Miklos Németh, the last communist prime minister of Hungary, perhaps the most important figure of the last days of the Iron Curtain, but someone few have heard of. The story of Hungary's transition begins with him. Chapter 2. The close of 1988 was bitter cold, even by the standards of Hungary, situated on a flat, windy plain that stretches from the foothills of the Alps on the west all the way to the Carpathians to the east. In the halls of power in Budapest, it was colder still. Hungary was in the midst of a massive economic downturn with spiking inflation rates and astronomical foreign debt, the highest per capita in Europe. There was a lot of hand-wringing in Parliament, but at root, no one knew what to do. This wasn't the Soviet Union. Food remained on the shelves, and queues didn't extend interminably from every shop, but prices were rising and wages were falling. Discontent was growing in every sector, with factory workers warming their hands over coffee and soldiers rationing coal in the barracks. The state was in a downward spiral. It had to borrow large sums of money from the West just to keep the heat on. Gas was purchased from the Soviet Union in hard currency, which Hungary didn't have. The government was in a bind. If it went bankrupt, there would be riots, but so might there be if it cut off the gas. And amid this frayed economy, The opposition was beginning to grow. As a placatory measure, earlier that year, the government had passed a law that authorized political opposition, officially the Association and Assembly Act. The reform was limited. These groups were not technically parties, as they didn't have the capacity to compete in elections, but now they could legally organize. This had been a watershed, and the opposition ranks swelled. Political activism was quite contained at this point, as most people were afraid to speak out. But a number of recent gatherings had turned into sizable rallies. Earlier that year, on June 27, 1988, as many as 30,000 people packed the Hero Square in central Budapest to protest the actions of Romanian dictator Nicolae Ceausescu, who had been persecuting ethnic Hungarians in Transylvania, the very cause that Maria Filip was simultaneously protesting in Debrecen. This was the largest demonstration anywhere in the Eastern Bloc for more than a generation. For Communist Party elites, this was a dangerous development. Because of the national affection many Hungarians felt for their brethren, these rallies could not be simply suppressed, but nor could their democratic character be denied. On October 23rd, students gathered at the Budapest Technical University to commemorate the quashed uprising against Soviet occupation in 1956. Thousands took to the streets. Thousands more stood by their windows applauding, some brazenly on their balconies, others more furtively peeking out behind the glass. In principle, this rally was to honor reformers of the past, but everyone could read between the lines. Elites within the ruling Hungarian Communist Party were growing nervous. They needed a solution to their economic woes, someone who could come in and right the ship. The answer arrived in the form of a talented young economist named Miklós Németh. At an extraordinary and contentious party conference in May, the Central Committee removed the aging autocrat, János Kádár, from his perch as General Secretary. He had been appointed by Moscow in 1956 after the revolution was suppressed, substituting another party functionary, then Prime Minister Károly Gross. Like Kádár, Gross was vehemently against political reform, but he was younger and better able to appreciate Hungary's economic straits. The party then selected Németh to take over as head of the government. This was not an easy decision. Németh had for years been a loyal comrade, climbing party ranks and proving his mettle. But he was a reformer, in favor of free markets and democratic elections. He had spent time in the United States, having won an economics scholarship to Harvard. Still, party brass felt they had no choice. If things went well, they reasoned, Németh could save the system, and if not, they could blame him and the other reformers for their failure. Németh took over as prime minister on November 24, 1988. At just 40 years old, he was the youngest prime minister in the Eastern Bloc and the second youngest in the world. The path to reform wouldn't be easy. As head of the government, Németh had some authority, but the real center of power was the party, headed by Gross. From the outset, rivalry between them was fierce. Németh wanted to be able to appoint his own cabinet, filling it with technocrats like himself rather than Politburo appointees, but Gross wouldn't tolerate this. He and the other party hardliners were distrustful of Németh and had no appetite for radical reform. They wanted him on a tight leash. For Németh, this lack of autonomy was crippling. He quickly understood he had been set up to fail. Privately, he referred to his appointment as prime minister as the kiss of death. He also discovered he was being spied on. There were bugs in his office. During one meeting of the Central Committee, snippets from private conversations with his aides were read aloud. Thereafter, Németh took to staging fictitious conversations in his office. He would engage in sensitive subjects only during walks outside, along the shores of the Danube. Nemeth hadn't been in power for a week when, on November 29th, Gross gave an address.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?